Buenas tardes a todos, por decir algo, porque buenas no lo son, en vista de lo ocurrido esta madrugada en Ucrania. Antes de empezar, la verdad es que desde la Fundación para el Avance de la Libertad aprovecho para expresar nuestra solidaridad con la sociedad ucraniana, ansiosa de libertad y ansiosa de un modelo en el que nosotros coincidimos, un Estado de Derecho, un entorno que respete las libertades de los ciudadanos, que ahora mismo pues, está conculcado por una invasión terrible por parte de la Federación Rusa y por parte de un personaje, Vladimir Putin, que ya a las claras se ha convertido en un dictador. Así que nuestros pensamientos están con todos los ucranianos y en especial con nuestros colegas del Movimiento de la Libertad, partners de Atlas Network, y que sepan que aquí siempre van a tener las puertas abiertas. Sin más, os doy la bienvenida a este evento que organizamos en la Fundación para el Avance de la Libertad. Soy Roxana Nicula, la presidenta ejecutiva de Fundalib, y sobre todo quiero empezar dándole las gracias a la Fundación Rafael del Pino por prestarnos sus magníficas instalaciones, por estar siempre allí, y espero que entre todos pues, podamos disfrutar de una velada estimulante y enriquecedora para todos los asistentes en la sala y también para todos los seguidores del streaming a través de nuestro canal en YouTube a partir de ahora. Para quienes todavía no nos conocéis, os contaré brevemente qué es Fundalib. La fundación ya tiene casi más de 6 años de vida, desde 2015, bajo la presidencia de Carlos Alberto Montaner, el escritorio cubano de liberal clásico y exiliado del régimen castrista, que se encuentra ahora mismo en Estados Unidos, en Miami. La Fundación es miembro de la red Atlas, de la Atlas Network, una red que agrupa a más de 500 organizaciones en más de 100 países del mundo, cuyo presidente, Matt Warner, ha viajado desde Washington, Estados Unidos, para estar hoy con nosotros y compartir un poco su experiencia, sus conocimientos sobre las soluciones que ponen en el día a día la pobreza en jaque mate, esperemos que pronto. En España, como fundación, la verdad es que aspiramos a jugar un papel cada vez más relevante y más creciente en la promoción de las ideas de la libertad, de las recetas que funcionan y que se tienen que aplicar también en nuestro país, en nuestra sociedad, obviamente adaptándose en base a las necesidades que tenemos como sociedad y que también pues, hoy aprenderemos muchísimo más con la ponencia de Matt. Para ello, nuestra principal prioridad, por así decirlo, es que estas ideas lleguen a todos los oídos posibles dentro de la sociedad civil, dentro del mercado que lo conformamos, al final todos nosotros, así como dentro de las instituciones públicas en todos los niveles. Nuestra actividad se divide en 3 áreas importantes. Una es la investigación comparativa, otra es la labor de concienciación y relaciones públicas dentro de la sociedad y en las instituciones, y con las instituciones sobre todo, y la tercera es la divulgativa, que es más para la parte de publicaciones, editorial, libros y divulgación. La investigación comparativa, en esta línea de actuación que venimos desarrollando, la Fundación trabaja ya desde hace varios años en 2 índices periódicos a nivel nacional, el Índice de Libertad Económica de las Ciudades Españolas, que además es un trabajo que ha ganado en 2019 el Premio de la Libertad, los Liberty Awards Europa, y otro sobre competitividad fiscal entre las comunidades autónomas, el Índice Autonómico de Competitividad Fiscal, que además quedó finalista un año anterior, en 2018, a estos mismos premios, y que además hoy está de enhorabuena porque esta semana ya hemos sabido que el Consejo General de Economistas de España ha decidido, a partir de su informe anual sobre competitividad de las regiones, incluir nuestro índice como fuente principal para toda la parte de fiscalidad. Así que, bueno, por lo menos sí que tenemos una muy buena noticia que celebrar hoy, a pesar de que es un día triste para la libertad. Y obviamente la mejor noticia es que vamos a tener a Matt Warner, que nos va a hablar sobre cómo podemos entre todos acabar con la lacra de la pobreza. Al mismo tiempo, también me gustaría hablar de los 2 índices a nivel mundial que desarrolla nuestra fundación, porque bueno, somos una fundación con una aspiración internacionalista, inmersos dentro de la globalización, y nos interesa mucho que nuestro trabajo, si puede ayudar, si puede servir de referencia en otras sociedades, pues que se pueda conocer y que pueda servir, ¿no? Estos índices son igual en el ámbito de la libertad, uno sobre libertad electoral a nivel mundial, y que está coordinado por el profesor José Antonio Peña de la Universidad de Granada, junto con un elenco de expertos en derecho electoral y de politólogos de diferentes países europeos y de América Latina, y el índice mundial de libertad moral, un índice que coordina a nuestro secretario general Juan Pina con un experto, un profesor de la Universidad de Derby en Gran Bretaña, Yasuhiro Kotera, y con la politóloga guatemalteca y además influencer y muy bien conocida por muchos, quizás, Gloria Álvarez, en América Latina. Pues estos trabajos periódicos, la verdad es que se han transformado en unas herramientas muy efectivas para impulsar determinadas reformas públicas, tanto a nivel local como a nivel autonómico, en el caso de los 2 índices que os comentaba al principio, y los índices internacionales pues, están ayudando en países como, por ejemplo, Nueva Zelanda, cuando intentaron pues, reformar la ley electoral para hacerla más estricta, o en países de América Latina, ayudaron a compañeros nuestros, a institutos similares a los nuestros ahí, tener y poder ganar esa batalla argumentativa contra aquellos intentos de limitar aún más el acceso a una libertad electoral de los ciudadanos de esas sociedades. Aparte de los estudios comparativos, nosotros trabajamos también diferentes otros tipos de informes, de análisis, que podéis encontrar todos en la página web, fundalib.org. Y os animo sobre todo, porque veo que hay muchísima gente más joven, que conozcáis de cerca más el índice reciente que hemos publicado, que es contra las trabas al emprendimiento. Es un análisis bastante ambicioso que hemos hecho, y aprovecho pues, para dar las gracias a Alberto Gómez, que junto conmigo pues, hemos trabajado, la verdad es que con muchísima pasión en sacar adelante este estudio, que además se engloba dentro de una campaña muchísimo más ambiciosa que ya llevamos desarrollando en el último año y medio, que se llama Joven y Emprendedor. Es una campaña que además ganó el Premio Mundial del Shark Tank dentro del encuentro mundial de Atlas Network todos los años, y la verdad es que es un concurso muy duro, y estamos muy orgullosos de que en 2019, a finales de 2019, nuestra fundación salió ganadora con este ilusionante proyecto. Así que después, si queréis acercaros y si tenéis interés en conocer un poco más qué es lo que queremos conseguir con esta campaña y con este estudio, estoy a vuestra disposición. Pues bien, en cuanto a la labor de concienciación y relaciones sociales y sobre todo la relación con la administración pública que desempeñamos en la Fundación, aparte de las campañas, nosotros la verdad es que tratamos de reunirnos con el mayor número de responsables públicos para poder hacerles ver un poco por dónde deberían ir las reformas que más nos beneficien como integrantes de la sociedad y en general a la sociedad en su conjunto. Así que bueno, hablamos con tejido asociativo, con instituciones públicas y por supuesto con asociaciones de la sociedad civil. La verdad es que estamos muy orgullosos porque ya nuestras soluciones, esa labor de hormiguita a lo largo de los años, pues está dando frutos. Nuestras soluciones ya han empezado a aplicarse desde hace varios años por diferentes administraciones a nivel local, a nivel autonómico, y lo mejor de todo, sin importar la orientación ideológica. Eso es lo bueno, eso es lo que tiene, digamos, el libertarismo. Así que por este lado seguiremos trabajando y esperemos que tengamos más éxitos en el futuro. Pero también me gustaría recordar brevemente la línea humanitaria que tenemos en la Fundación, porque, bueno, desgraciadamente sabemos que en el mundo no todo el mundo vive en sociedades libres. Lo acabamos de volver a recordar esta madrugada, y la Fundación tiene también un trabajo bastante sentido dentro de esta línea, trabajando para ayudar y rescatar personas importantes para nuestras ideas de diferentes regímenes tiránicos. Y la última línea de trabajo, como os comentaba, es la de la divulgación. Tenemos una estrecha colaboración con Unión Editorial, que es una casa que suele publicar mucho todas las obras de las ideas de la libertad. Tenemos una colección dentro de la Unión Editorial que se llama Colección Avance, que todos los años publica un libro, así que os animo a conocer las publicaciones. El último libro que hemos publicado en 2022 es la Guía de la Libertad para principiantes. Y también os animo a conocer la revista que sacamos todos los meses en papel y en digital. Incluso os podéis suscribir a través del programa de Patreon de la Fundación. Y sin más, la verdad es que me gustaría ya pasar a presentar a nuestro especial invitado de hoy y darle paso, porque él es el protagonista de nuestra jornada de hoy. Pues bien, vamos a, si os parece, pues bueno, os hago así un breve recorrido. La verdad es que no voy a empezar a enumerar todos los logros de Matt Warner, porque los tenéis en atlasnetwork.org. Y me gustaría un poco más resaltar la faceta más humana de Matt y el modo en el que él, quizás por su faceta de facilitador, por la Georgetown University, pues ha tenido a lo largo de los años con los partners, con todos nosotros, para ayudarnos a poder sacar adelante los proyectos cada vez mejor y poder llegar a más sitios y a más instituciones. Al mismo tiempo, sí que me gustaría de alguna manera resaltar que Matt, por ejemplo, es una persona incansable a la hora de escribir en un montón de medios de comunicación muy importantes a nivel internacional, en Estados Unidos, desde Washington Post a The Hill, en Forbes. Tiene podcasts, tiene una serie de preguntas y respuestas con Matt Warner, que os invito de verdad a escucharle, porque es que merece la pena, y tiene toda una serie de libros escritos, uno de los cuales, Desarrollo con Dignidad, que además dio pie a esta conferencia de hoy, que merece la pena y que lo tenéis ahí fuera, así que bueno, cuando salgáis podéis ir, los chicos fuera os van a ir entregando un ejemplar. Pero sí que me gustaría recordaros que en el libro El Manual Liberal, que coordina Antonella Martí, Matt Warner tiene un capítulo muy sentido que se llama Acabar con la pobreza en el siglo XXI, que yo creo que merece la pena verdaderamente leer. Y voy a concluir solamente citando un pequeño fragmento del libro que dio de alguna manera pie a esta conferencia, y es un libro que verdaderamente, la verdad es que es difícil sacar algo de ahí que no merezca convertirse en tweets, memes y todo tipo de citas, porque es que es un libro utilísimo, pero bueno, al final ya he decidido que voy a sacar una pequeña parte solo, porque todo es fantástico, y ahí vamos. Es de todo sabido que cualquier comprensión de la economía pasa por aceptar el papel del empresario como aquella persona que se arriesga a emprender. Ser empresario no tiene una connotación de pertenencia a una determinada clase social o grupo étnico. Una mujer pobre puede ejercer su emprendimiento cuando coloca su puesto de venta en un mercado local. Un hombre pobre lo ejerce cuando se da cuenta que podría ganar más dinero para él y su familia si decide trabajar en las minas de África del Sur. Empresarios no son solo Edison, Forbes o los Bezos o Musk, Ibrahims y más. Todos nosotros ejercemos el emprendimiento hasta cierto nivel. No es una característica adscrita, sino un rasgo de la actividad humana. En efecto, antes de que Matt pase a comentarnos un poco todo esto ya más en profundidad, ya que vosotros, pues, por supuesto, después le podéis preguntar las dudas o en qué queréis que os cuente, vamos a ver un pequeño vídeo que la verdad es que merece la pena sobre la labor que tanto Atlas Network como un poco el marco de referencia que nosotros defendemos hace por ayudar a acabar de alguna manera con esta lacra de la pobreza en el mundo.
सन 1978 से कांच की चूड़ियों का उत्पादन और विक्रय दोनों ही सरोज नगर बाबू मार्केट में करता हूँ। मेरे दिल्ली पुलिस और एनडीएमसी दोनों ही लोग मेरा सामान उठाकर ले जाते थे। तब एक अकेला था, अब मैं लाखों करोड़ों की आवाज हूँ, जनप्रतिनिधि हूँ।
So street vendors were victims of harassment, were victims of extortion. Municipalities deliberately didn't issue them licenses so that their officials can charge them money, can harass them, can extort, and even the police did the same to them.
जब सामान उठा के ले जाती थी तो नई दिल्ली नगर पालिका परिषद द्वारा जो सामान मेरा जब्त किया जाता था उसको मैं एक प्रार्थना लिखता था कि मेरा सामान इस जगह से सामान उठाया गया है, इस तारीख को उठाया गया है। उसका ये मैंने इंडेक्स बनाया हुआ है। इंडेक्स के जो मैं 1978 में आया उसकी ये पर्ची है, ये नक्शा है मेरा। तो जब ये सामान ले जाते तो जो छुड़ाने की मेरे पास रसीद है उसका ये सब प्रूफ है मेरे पास। उस समय मुझे बहुत तकलीफ होती थी कि मैं सामान जो लगाता था उसमें से मेरा सामान आधा टूट जाता था, कुछ सामान नुकसान हो जाता तो मुझे बहुत तकलीफ होती थी।
The amount of bribe that they have to pay, just to give you an example, for the city of Delhi, there are 600,000 street vendors. On average, a street vendor pays about 200 rupees a month bribe to the officers, right? Which is about $4 a month that they pay in a bribe. If you just multiply those two numbers, 600,000 by say $4, it's $2.4 million per month, which is collected from the poorest of the poor in the nation's capital. So we had to fight this battle of legalizing street vendors at the local level. So we ran a campaign in the two cities of India, in Jaipur and Patna, and mobilized the street vendors, mobilized the government machinery to understand the challenges they are facing, work with them to draft a particular kind of a law that will change the status of street entrepreneurs from being completely informal to being somewhat formal in the regulatory system. You can see the example of the benefit of that in terms of the story of Dinesh, who has been working there for more than 40 years, right? Has been always looked down upon by the system, and finally he is now elected to a town vending committee, which is a committee that supervises and regulates the vending space in the city. He is now able to sit across the table from the same officers who used to beat him up and harass him, and be able to challenge them in terms of how they think about the lives of the people like him.
नगर पटरी विक्रय, लेकिन 2014 का जब एक्ट आया है उससे हमें बहुत ज़्यादा बल मिला है, और बल के साथ में समाज का भी भला करने के लिए हमारी सोच बदल गई है। तो मैं लगातार उसके लिए प्रयास कर रहा हूँ समाज के अच्छे से अच्छा भला करने के लिए, और उसमें मेरे को बहुत हौसला दिया हुआ है।
more than anything else, I think what the Act has done for individuals like Dinesh and street vendors across the country has really given them a possibility of steering and being a part of their own governance, and has been immensely empowering.
जूते पहन के सोता हूँ ताकि मेरा पत्रिका कोई आवाज दे, मुझे 1 मिनट नहीं लगा, मैं तुरंत उसके साथ खड़ा रहता हूँ। अब मैं सोचता हूँ पूरे हिंदुस्तान में जितने पटरी वाले हैं सब मेरे भाई हैं और सबके लिए मैं काम करूँगा।
Thank you, Roxana, for that introduction, and I want to also thank you, Roxana, for beginning this evening with our friends in Ukraine, close to our hearts. That certainly is on my mind today and echoes throughout this broader liberty movement around the world, and I hope our friends in Ukraine know that and know that we are listening and ready to help in any way that we can. But the video we have just started with is designed, I think, successfully to raise the point about an important concept. The story of Dinesh Dixit you've seen is about many things. Of course, it's about livelihood, it's about entrepreneurship, it's about justice and freedom, but it is also about dignity. And this is a universal story. This is an example in India, but it applies in my country of the United States. Similar things happen, and perhaps here in Spain as well. And the concept of dignity is getting more attention right now in the field of economic development, and for good reason. Because the modern idea of human dignity asks us to afford every person the freedom and respect to live their lives as they choose. And as it turns out, this moral ideal is also an economic strategy. It's a practical thing. It's morally correct to treat people this way, and it is also economically advantageous. Why is this so? Well, in 1990, the Princeton economist William Baumol published a landmark paper in entrepreneurship in which he made this observation: the supply of entrepreneurs is not the variable that a nation needs to worry about most, if at all. The variable that matters most is what he calls the rules of the game. This is a deep insight, if you ask me. What are the rules of the game? Well, the rules of the game are found in the beliefs, the cultural norms, and all the legal provisions and practices that govern economic activity. It covers quite a lot of influences. So taken together, all of these institutions will influence whether enterprising behaviors contribute to productive activity. Specifically, they will determine whether or not entrepreneurship drives innovation in society that benefits it, or whether it drives something that is less productive and even destructive. It all depends on the rules of the game. For an example, in medieval China, Baumol points to the phenomenon that civil servants in that time period were seen as the most respected in society. And they were held in such high regard that the best and brightest minds devoted all of their time and talents to preparing for entrance exams to serve in government. If successful, they then would spend all of their time, once they got this position, on studying philosophy and practicing calligraphy and things like this. Two things that are certainly worthy pursuits, nothing wrong with those two things, but they're not necessarily likely to create double-digit growth rates for your country. So the cultural, social, and institutional rules of the game at that time afforded the most dignity to those who mastered those types of pursuits. And so those rules then heavily influenced the ways the enterprising people spent their energy. And this, of course, had consequences for the economy as a whole. There were others in China who were enterprising in ways that did add to the size of the economic pie. The merchant class, for example, made sure that the flow of goods met demand, and some of those merchants became very wealthy. But interestingly, what did they do with their wealth when it came to the future of their children? They invested their wealth in preparing their children to become civil servants. They didn't want for their children to become like them. Why? Because they were not respected for the role that they played in society. So in this way, the rules of the game discouraged productive entrepreneurship and instead encouraged unproductive entrepreneurship. Now, there's no reason to pick on medieval China. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most societies looked down on the merchant class. Respectable wealth throughout time immemorial was mostly gained through exploitative processes that did not create social or economic value. Wealth was a function of norms and practices related to artificial constructs such as class, nobility, and privilege. In fact, Baumol states that in feudal Europe, in his estimation, the aristocratic hierarchies controlled over 80% of economic output. So if you think about that in the framework of productive and unproductive and destructive entrepreneurship, 80% of the output was through unproductive machinations. What changed to make the Industrial Revolution possible? Well, the rules of the game, and specifically the new human dignity ideal that throughout the 18th and 19th centuries led some societies closer to a widespread cultural practice of respecting self-determining behavior and holding in high esteem those who, through their own merits, generated market value through entrepreneurial behavior. So for the first time on such a scale, where one started in life became much less important than what one could make of oneself. This new thinking influenced more than just the way people thought. It influenced the legal institutions that formed to govern economic activity and paved the way for a new social process that accelerated innovation. For entrepreneurs, this meant that their talents would find their biggest rewards, both economically and socially, through productive pursuits. As a result, this new process for innovation and wealth creation began to bear unprecedented fruit. Now, specifically, that fruit is what the economic historian Deirdre McCloskey refers to as the Great Enrichment, a 3,000% increase in standard of living over just a couple of centuries. Now, consider this mind-boggling fact. Over 97% of humanity's wealth was created in just the last 0.01% of our history. This concentrates the mind to take great care in understanding precisely why this happened and what we can do to protect those processes today. In the book Better Capitalism by Carl Schramm and Bob Lighton, they provide what I think is probably the most succinct and profound summation of what every country should be trying to create. And that is what they write as a successful economy has a process of constant and continual entrepreneurial revolution. Synonymous with the focus on the rules of the game, the focus here is on getting the process right. True markets are a process where robust change is free to take place through decentralized experimentation, where the culture honors the pursuit of entrepreneurs to disrupt and innovate. Why is this important? Because a solution that requires getting the process right is a very different kind of solution than one that is just outcome-based. By way of analogy, in the 1970s, or late 60s, early 70s, there was a soap company in the United States called Unilever, and they used a spray nozzle to take the liquid form of their product and turn it into a powder that they could then turn into soap. But the problem with their spray nozzle is it wasn't very good. It would get clogged. Sometimes when it would spray at different rates, and it ended up really creating a lot of downtime in their business. So they needed to create a better nozzle, and they asked their product designers in-house to work on this problem, and they tried to design a better nozzle using their technical expertise, and they failed. They could not create a nozzle that was more effective. Until someone else in the company, an evolutionary biologist working in a different division, was asked to come in. His name was Stephen Jones, and his solution was not to design an outcome, but rather to get the process right. He took the nozzle and made 10 random variations of the design and then tested those variations. And then he took the best out of that testing round and did 10 more variations randomly, and then took the best of that. He did this 43 rounds worth. Again, just randomly changing the design and seeing which ones worked best. And what he ended up with at the end of these 43 rounds was a much more successful nozzle, something that was highly more efficient and is closer to what we use today. No engineers or designers who have studied that new design, the one that ended up working really well, can explain why it is the best performing nozzle. They don't know why it works. No one can, because no one designed it. And Jones understood that an open process of randomization was the better model for success than for this particular type of a problem than a more linear approach designed by experts. Complexity economist Eric Beinhocker describes that process in the context of economic development as evolution-like, right? And he describes these three critical steps. Differentiate, something has to be different, something to compare it to. Select, and then amplify. So you have to have differences, and then you have to be able to select, and then you have to be able to amplify. And that's how the evolutionary process results in better design. Describing economic development strategy, Beinhocker also said this: we may not be able to predict or direct economic evolution, but we can design our institutions to be better or worse evolvers. This is powerful. Evolution is a knowledge creation machine, he says, a learning algorithm. The innovations that emerge are a social phenomenon. Not even the entrepreneur, as important as an entrepreneur is to the innovation process, not even the entrepreneur is wholly responsible for what can be called innovation. Okay? A helpful illustration of this claim is shared by Matt Ridley in his book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. Everyone in this room is probably familiar with wheeled luggage. We probably all own luggage with wheels on it. Surely whoever came up with this idea of putting wheels on luggage probably got very rich, right? That's a great idea. At some point in time, we didn't have wheeled luggage, and now we do. Well, as it turns out, Ridley found patents for wheeled luggage 50 years before wheeled luggage became commercially successful. And not only did he find patents from the 1920s, but he found new patents for the same invention over and over again until the 1970s, when finally wheeled luggage became common, and you saw it everywhere and you could buy it. So why did it take so long to catch on? What was this difference between invention and what we could call innovation? To answer this question, we must remember that innovation is about the validation of an invention by the broader market. It's not just the inventor that decides the value, it's the market, all of us together. And that the form that the final innovation takes is often iterations away from the initial invention itself. It's refined to suit the market. And Ridley cites several possibilities that explain for this particular case why wheeled luggage took so long to go from invention to innovation. First, until the 1970s, travel was not widely accessible beyond the wealthy people. And wealthy people at the time tended to have support staff, porters, and those sort of things to carry luggage. So those who might prefer wheeled luggage weren't burdened with carrying them around. Also, they probably most importantly, because the scale was smaller for the number of travelers, old airports, old train stations, old bus depots, the scale was, you didn't need to carry luggage that far. You know, you could drive up and park close or whatever it was. So it wasn't until the market grew and many more of us were enjoying the benefits of air travel, etc., that the scale of where we needed to take luggage changed, and also, we didn't have as much support staff around us as it became democratized. And so as a result, the invention became commercially viable. So what I'm describing is not meant to diminish the role of the inventor or the entrepreneur, but rather to augment in our thinking the important role of the broader decentralized process itself. It plays a very important role. Consider the case of life insurance in the U.S. market. Life insurance, as you think about it, well, that's an innovative product, has great benefit. But when it was first offered for sale in the mid-19th century in the United States, nobody bought it. Some sociologists and economists have looked at that market and they thought, well, maybe they had crude actuarial tables and they didn't really have a good system, but that wasn't the case. They couldn't explain it until you look at the way that society talked about life insurance, and in particular religious leaders. It was thought of as immoral. This idea that in their framing, why should you win the lottery when your loved one dies? That's in poor taste, right? And so it became a market decision that was influenced by an attitude about the rectitude of that decision. It wasn't until years later, in fact 4 decades later, that society reframed the idea of life insurance completely opposite, as actually a market decision that reflected taking responsibility, doing your duty, taking care of your family. And so we can see here that the economic viability in terms of it being of value for the price that was offered, that was all sound. But it was the attitudes around it, the rules of the game in addition to some of the things that we typically think of that made the difference. So the complexity of innovative processes shows us that it's a mistake to pretend that all of this can be managed and controlled. Instead, the evolutionary aspects of innovation discovery help us appreciate the kind of enabling institutional environment, the rules of the game, that make success most likely. The evolutionary philosopher Daniel Dennett put it this way: evolution is a search algorithm that finds needles of good design in haystacks of possibility. Applied to the evolutionary process of the market, the role of the entrepreneur is critical to this process because it is the entrepreneur who spreads out across the full landscape of possibilities and does the hard work of searching for something that will take, something that works. Their productive success, meaning not whether or not their efforts yield positive value for society, again going back to Baumol, is not just a function of their own talents. Remember that enterprising people can also be, in a corrupt system, unproductive, even destructive. Most critically, their productive success is a function of the rules of the game that protect the dignity of individuals to use their freedom to find, among unconstrained possibilities, positive-sum solutions, and who likewise benefit within a system where others enjoy the freedom to pivot to what works. Remember, the differentiate, select, and amplify. All three need freedom. Because the freedom of others is needed to move from invention to innovation. We all need the freedom, everyone in the system. Dinesh needs to have freedom in order for others in that system to also succeed. So we can conclude that ultimately, for the economic growth process to succeed, freedom must be universal. And we need the freedom to differentiate as what's already been done. We can't have the same thing. You can't have a government mandate, this is the kind of car we're all going to use. You don't have any differentiation. And you have to be able to have the freedom to say, well, I prefer this one. And then lots of people need to be able to do that so that we amplify what ends up being of value to society. So to animate and attract entrepreneurial talent to this most productive of processes, we need a culture that affords dignity to every individual to opt in and contribute according to their own preferences, opportunities, and talents. This is the non-ideological argument for free markets and personal freedom. It works because for the complex system of an economy, decentralized evolutionary processes are best for discovering innovation, which you need to create wealth. So we must address the debate in economic development between democracy and autocracy. Some have looked at the Asian miracle and some examples in Africa and have concluded that, well, early on, countries benefit when you take control, and then later, once you can develop the economy some and increase growth, then maybe you introduce democracy. They treat democracy as though it were some luxury. But in this framing that I've been sharing, I want to argue that it is actually fundamentally practical, as well as moral, to start with democracy. Because the institutional changes that you'll need going from wherever you are starting, and that's different in every place, you need to take into account the data that comes from personal individual preferences, histories, culture, and desire, to find the institutional path toward what is going to increase the evolutionary process to discover innovation. Does that make sense? So in our new book, Development with Dignity, my co-author and I publish the latest data comparing autocracy and democracy. We aren't the first to do this, but we've updated the data with some more modern sources. and with newer dates. And our analysis shows that autocracy is a risky bet. Instead, democracy is the surest way to raise standards of living and grow the economy. Michael Schumann's book, The Miracle, The Epic Story of Asia's Quest for Growth, shows that in growth success cases such as South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and China, the real heroes are the entrepreneurs, not the autocrats. The entrepreneurs are the ones who creatively responded to changes in the rules of the game, both cultural and legal, and went in search of new innovations. They're the ones who did the hard work of solving the nation's economic problems in their particular contexts. We must also question the wisdom of copycatting examples of powerful states placing big bets on exports as a sufficient strategy for growth. To be sure, trade is essential for success. Free trade is probably one of the most successful exercises for raising standards of living. But both exports and imports matter, and it's not the only thing that matters, the only tool for success. And those who rely on, as some autocratic-leaning countries might do, say, let's put all our eggs in exports only, that is not only a big risk, but what we're finding today is that the payoff in this new global world is just a little bit different. Markets change over time. So development economist Danny Roderick has argued that as the global economy continues to evolve, big bets on export growth only are unlikely to pay off at the same levels that they have in some particular examples around the world, getting double-digit growth. Just less likely. It doesn't mean it's not going to pay off, it's just not going to get double-digit growth alone. What you also need instead is countries also adopting strategies for domestic competitiveness within their country. And I think this is where, in addition to advocating for free trade, we should spend more of our time to increase this as a strategy for economic success. Harvard's Growth Lab's analysis for Spain, by the way, notes that exports have become a shrinking segment of the economy, and they recommend that future growth can be driven by, quote, a process of diversifying know-how to produce a broader and increasingly more complex set of goods and services. Those innovative leaps into new product spaces are made most likely when the rules of the game allow for as much experimentation and entrepreneurship across Spain's entire population as possible. So for this reason, I believe that domestic tools such as Fundalib's Index of Economic Freedom for Spanish Cities will become even more essential going forward for revealing successful growth strategies as all countries now, as I observe, are beginning to look at these kinds of tools. For Dinesh Dixit, the institutional changes that legalized his work and afforded him the dignity of representing himself and his peers in government councils are an example of a new set of rules that encourage productive entrepreneurship. The lesson all countries must learn is that when the rules of the game discourage anyone of any socioeconomic status from applying their energy towards productive entrepreneurship, then economic development drags, and everyone suffers as a consequence. Threats to the dignity afforded the entrepreneur come in many forms. Of course, the often politicized envy of success is a familiar one, but perhaps less obvious, but just as damaging, to the reputation of the entrepreneur in society is the entrepreneur's own inconsistency in demonstrating the virtue of self-reliance. Only up to and until privileges and anti-competitive measures can be persuasively cloaked in appeals to national well-being to justify them. So it's not just the capacity for deceit that I think explains this inconsistency, but just as likely the psychological trick to which we are all susceptible that leads us to convince ourselves that when it comes to a particular case that favors us personally, an exception must be made, meaning the government should intervene if it's on behalf of my business, right? This is the inconsistency I'm speaking of. May I suggest then that the recipe for Spain's national economic success going forward, growing on strength to strength, is beginning with a commitment among the nation's entrepreneurs to demonstrate and indeed take great pride in a consistency and fidelity to this process of constant and continual entrepreneurial revolution. Embracing this ideal without flinching and carries with it the implicit challenge to be ready and willing to constantly and continually reinvent oneself, to meet the changing needs of the market, and to allow others the freedom and the dignity to do the same. Such a commitment, if honored, will position any nation for success in a 21st century economic environment that favors in addition to free trade with foreigners, those who invest in their own domestic competitiveness. Combined with such tools as the Index of Economic Freedom for Spanish cities, history has taught us that shared prosperity will surely follow. Thank you very much.
Vamos a dar ahora paso a dudas, preguntas. Podéis preguntar también en español. Matt está intentando mejorar su español y tiene ganas de también escucharos, no necesariamente en inglés. Así que, bueno, Lucía...
Ayúdame a practicar.
Levantad la mano y Lucía os va a dar el micro. Por ahí detrás.
Hi, Matt. I'm just wondering about this. You were speaking about how the entrepreneurs had to be able to transmit or maybe to explain to the population about, you know, how they do and about the benefits of entrepreneurship and whatnot. But I think, talking about the rules of the game, the whole image of the entrepreneurship is I mean, we have a bad image because we have this bad image on the rich, on richness, which is like, I don't know if an entrepreneur is successful, he will be rich. And all this rhetoric we have about inequality, the wage gap, and all that, I think it totally works against it. So the minute you have an entrepreneur who's successful, it's absolutely, I mean, immediately targeted as a rich guy, which is the wage gap and whatnot. Do you think this global rhetoric of equality and wage gap is a really, how much of a handicap is it in order to create the proper rules of the game in order for us to flourish or succeed?
Yeah, well, I think the opportunity, given the way that inequality is discussed, the opportunity for those who care about the kind of messages and insights that Baumol has given us are to do a couple of things. One, make sure that we aren't just thinking of entrepreneurs as those who have already been very successful, but also the very modest entrepreneurs. In some places around the world, this might be micro enterprises, you know, a street vendor. But also somebody who is not rich but borrows a little money from family and starts a little business at a modest level. To appreciate the role that plays in a modern successful economy is sometimes lost. And if I can refer you to, I mentioned the book Better Capitalism, but there's an earlier version called Good Capitalism, Bad Capitalism. And in that book, the key thesis is that successful economies have mixed firm sizes. It's not all a couple of big firms and lots of little tiny firms, but a really rich diversity of all sizes of firms. And so in order to have that, you've got to have a lot of new stuff in the pipeline. So that's one piece, is to make sure that we're talking about entrepreneurs in the more universal spectrum of entrepreneurs. Secondly, I think when government favors some entrepreneurs over others, that really makes it difficult to make this case, because it takes away the argument that they're producing value for society, full stop, right? So that's another piece that has to change. But then on the inequality piece, I'm very persuaded by an observation that Harvard economist Ricardo Hausman made about inequality, where he said, a redistributionist solution to inequality is like giving a consolation prize to those who've been excluded from the benefits of our economy and saying, well, sorry it didn't work out for you, here's something to make poverty more tolerable. That is a terrible solution. What we should be doing is making our institutions, the rules of the game, as inclusive as possible to allow everyone the benefits of the formal market that we administer. And so I think you can start with an inequality debate. You don't have to disagree with the premise that given the fact that we do have privileges and favors in all of our societies, and certainly, you know, when I think of where I come from, there's plenty of examples of this, preferential treatment, then we have to acknowledge that some of the income inequality or the wealth inequality has been achieved not through productive entrepreneurship alone. And so to remedy that though, what we need to do is create more inclusive market spaces. And by looking at the barriers to entry that many of our sort of tired and old institutional bureaucracies have grown over the years, and clean them up, make it easier. We have one state in the United States that's just done something very new, and they call it a regulatory sandbox. And what it means is if you want to start a new business, instead of having to immediately comply with all of the rules that the big companies have to comply with because they already know how to do it and they kind of use those to keep other people out, you have a 2-year grace period where you can do whatever you want. And then if your business is successful, then you might start having to comply with certain things. But it gives some space for this experimentation that we all need happening. And anyway, so I think some combination of those things needs to happen in order to create a different image and reputation of entrepreneurs.
Buenas tardes, Matt. Te voy a hacer la pregunta en español. A menudo, el grupo de empresarios en un país son más anti-libre mercado que los miembros del Partido Comunista. ¿Cómo se explica eso?
Well, there have been many theories about why this is. Rather than give a review of them, I think what we have to conclude is entrepreneurs we should not think of as another example of a constituency in society that needs to advocate for itself, but rather a fundamental aspect of the institutions that we're trying to build, not on their behalf, because at the personal level, I think people get into a certain context that has them, you know, I think saying silly things and believing silly things. But my position is certainly, I've never described myself, for example, as pro-business. That is not what I am. I am not out to protect any particular business. I am out to protect the freedom of and the opportunities that the institutions should protect for anybody to be incentivized to use their talents to create value and to benefit from that as they earn that benefit through convincing the rest of us that what they've done on our behalf is worth the money we're parting for it. So I don't look to successful entrepreneurs to be the best advocates for the institutions that under which entrepreneurship flourishes.
Hello, good afternoon, Matt. I have two questions for you, and one of them is not directly related to entrepreneurship, but in the end, everything is related. So I think our country has many structural issues. So one of them is, for instance, saving money, and for instance, the pension system nowadays. So I want to ask you advice, if you have some advice on this. Like, do you recommend any particular way of saving, like for young professionals or this kind of people, so that we can have some guarantee, we can guarantee ourselves some kind of income in the future? As you might know, like the Spanish pension system is like very damaged right now. So I think it's a big concern for our generation.
Well, I think regardless of public policy options, I mean, the advice I've received within my own family and the advice I will give my children is not to depend on a government resource ultimately. And I think part of the mind shift that is most beneficial but scary for some to adopt, particularly younger generations, is that the pursuit of guarantee is probably the riskiest thing you can do. You need to embrace the uncertainty of life and of markets, not so that you are living risk with, living a life of risk, but so that you can correctly account for risk and minimize it as much as possible. And obviously, there are many pension systems done through the government that are, if they were non-governmental, they would be illegal. They would be called Ponzi schemes, right? And there's a reason that those are illegal, because they don't create any value whatsoever. And so, as it relates to advice for young generations, I think taking personal responsibility and doing that early, and realizing as a point of encouragement that one of the most powerful variables in the equation is time, and you've got it if you're young. And so take advantage of that. And I also want to make sure any of these questions where you'd like to join in, feel free to.
Thank you, Matt. Si queréis, os contesto también en español esta vez. Así obligamos a Matt a hacer un poco más de ejercicio del español. Probablemente, como incluso diría nuestra gran amiga de la libertad, Gloria Álvarez, es el mejor siglo para ser joven, para ser mujer, para ser lo que quieras ser en esta vida, el siglo que nos ha tocado vivir. Porque tenemos a nuestro alcance, gracias a la globalización, a las nuevas tecnologías, a la revolución que supone blockchain, la red distribuida de la que todos formamos parte, unas herramientas potentísimas para que cada uno de nosotros proveamos para nuestro propio futuro y no dependamos de ningún autócrata, de ningún autoritario, de ningún bien intencionado, porque me gustaría pensar que la mayoría de estos representantes que tienen una mentalidad muy intervencionista, pues realmente piensan que están haciendo el bien y que lo están haciendo por nuestro bien, pero que se equivocan. Al igual que nos comentaba Matt antes, la sociedad está llena de complejidades, llena de aspectos que están cambiando constantemente, y más en la revolución tecnológica en la que estamos inmersos como sociedad global, donde vemos que hay un fenómeno de la aceleración que hace que ninguna planificación centralizada de nuestras instituciones pueda resistir a semejantes cambios, y es mejor que los individuos, las personas que conformamos nuestro mundo, tengamos la mayor autonomía posible, pero para tener esa mayor autonomía posible necesitamos unas reglas claras, reglas que no cambian con cada Consejo de Ministros, con cada gobierno que se reúne y deciden que a partir de mañana pues vamos a tener otro papeleo más que rellenar, más trabas, más impuestos. Estuvimos anteayer con Matt para charlar con unos chavales en un instituto que están ya en los últimos años de bachillerato, ya preparándose, algunos para ir a la universidad, algunos para hacer formación profesional, y es increíble el nivel de preparación para la vida que tenían estos chicos, y que lo primero que les venía a la mente cuando les preguntaba sobre, bueno, ¿tú quieres emprender algo, quieres hacer algo por tu cuenta, empezar algún negocio? Y todos decían, a mí me gustaría, lo que pasa es que en España es imposible, porque hay tantas trabas, la cuota de autónomos. Lo primero, me hizo muchísima gracia porque había varios de ellos que lo primero que nos dijeron es que es la cuota de autónomos, porque mi papá es un pequeño empresario y le estoy escuchando con mi madre todos los meses, ¡ay, que viene la cuota de autónomos! Eso es impensable. Lo que tenemos que hacer es cambiar la realidad nosotros mismos, y es un poco lo que estamos intentando hacer, lo que está intentando hacer la red Atlas, de ayudarnos a todos los miembros que conformamos esta red a ver un poco cuáles son las mejores estrategias en que nosotros podemos trabajar como instituciones, como personas en nuestra sociedad, y hacer que nuestras instituciones pues, sean nuestras aliadas y no sean un estorbo, una lacra, una losa que nos están tirando y nos están impidiendo ser autónomos. Con lo cual, yo creo que el mayor consejo, la mayor reflexión que podríamos hacer cada uno es que la administración, que la sociedad, las instituciones públicas, lo mejor que pueden hacer es dejarnos hacer, es decir, apartarnos y dejarnos hacer, y ellas simplemente asegurarse de que esas reglas del juego son las mismas para todos, no se cambian con cada Consejo de Ministros y son clarísimas y sin mucho papeleo, mucha burocracia. ¿Sí? Lucía, ¿el micro? No.
No, I think that probably there are no more questions. So I would like, before we end the lecture, the event today, is it working? Yes. To ask Matt to maybe make a small summary of what the Atlas Network is, because some of the people in the room know a lot about Atlas Network, but many others are for the first time getting to know, well, in this case, the president of the Atlas Network, and I think that could be important.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity. Atlas Network is celebrating our 40th year. We were founded in the early 80s by a gentleman who had founded a think tank for the ideas of individual liberty in markets in London in the 1950s. And that think tank was influential through the 1970s and onward, so that he started to get asked to help start other think tanks. And so by the 1980s, he founded this organization that I work for to support the growth and establishment of independent think tanks throughout the world who have a commitment to the institutions of liberal democracy and doing the research and the hard independent work of demonstrating pathways to these ideals in context. And so our model is very much a supporting role. We raise money to make grants to support think tanks around the world. We also convene the think tank leaders to learn from each other, not to learn from us, but to sort of spark that innovation that happens among peers, and to identify excellence and celebrate with award programming. And one thing that I want to put in context that I think is really interesting is that the international development field right now is struggling with, this is very new, how to achieve what they call localization, which means how do we achieve development without it being led by outsiders from other countries? You know, the famous Jeffrey Sachs, the economist from Columbia University that would go around and try to solve poverty all over the place and fail miserably because it's not a technical problem. It's a social phenomenon that you solve iteratively by empowering individuals to make decisions as agents. Anyway, so this model that we have, we think is a good example of how localization can work. So we get to know think tanks such as Fundalib. They share with us their vision for change, help us understand what the challenges are in this particular context, and then we do what we can to support them. We are modest in size. We're not Gates Foundation, but we think this model is actually more effective than trying to find what's that one technical solution that's going to solve poverty. It's going to be a lot of different solutions, and it matters who's making the decision of what to try and how to go about it. And we think outsiders have a role to play, but it's a supporting role.
There's one last question.
Hi, Matt. I have a question. In one part of the video, the person says, "I sleep with my shoes on so I can work more." That phrase for socialists is synonymous with capital oppression, not freedom. How can we respond with a libertarian outlook?
Well, let me clarify. He said, "I sleep with my shoes on so that when one of his peers, the other street vendors, has a problem with the police or with the government, he can come and help quickly." So it isn't to work more. It's actually to try to help and intervene when his fellow entrepreneurs are being oppressed. Look, if somebody can find a way that we can solve poverty with everybody working less, show me where that's working. Also, I suspect that, especially if you get to know someone like Dinesh, there is dignity in work. There is dignity in creating value. It is the goal to create a society where people are free to pursue the kinds of work that they can both create value and feel that sort of personal level of interest and reward. Everybody is in pursuit of this thing, and one of the things that frustrates me is when outsiders try to deny the stages of development that a country may be going through to get them closer to a place where they can experience both the material and the spiritual benefit of having choices, but they may not be there yet. But they need to get there. So let them get there.
I mean, the idea of one size fits all, it's a very, very bad idea in general. So this is a very simple message that from a libertarian perspective should be, distributed to the society, because this kind of simple ideas people understand and they embrace easily. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm one who is alcoholic, and I was telling Matt, I probably be working until the day I die because I love what I'm doing. But there are other people who don't. Let's not set some fixed standards. Everyone must work 4 hours per day, 1 hour, 8 hours, 20 hours. Everybody needs aspirations, things they want to do are so different, even between twins. So can we be so arrogant from the public institutions, from the society, from the think tanks, from the political parties to decide for them, no, you have to work 1 hour, 8 hours, 10 hours. It's not how the world is working, Is there any? Okay. You.
Hello, Matt. I have a question because I'm from mainland China, and I also studied here. I also have many Chinese friends who also studied business administration here in Spain. So they all wanted to stay here in Spain for doing business. But the problem is that just the question that the question before, that my Chinese friends actually, they were facing tremendous problems when they were trying to do business in Spain. They have to submit a lot of documents for solving the problems of regulations, and they have to pay taxations, and sometimes they have been tortured by the bureaucratic guys. And also another issue that Spain has, I think, a policy that is anti-immigration, because we have personally, my friends and I, that we have to, before we apply for the permanent residence here, we have to renew our residence 1 year by year. So it's very inconvenient. So we know that in the United States that the policies in the previous years, which probably were much better than Spain. So do you have any policy recommendations for Spain which can help Spain to have not only immigration friendly policy, but for the immigration who are who want to contribute to the entrepreneur activities, and also like they are high, well-trained scientists. Do you have any policy recommendation? Thank you.
I'll make a general observation and then one specific idea that's just emerged recently, but then generally I'll defer to any policy recommendations for Spain to Roxana. But in general, you start with the principle that, again, going back to what is it that your country's after, and if you make it as easy as possible for as many people as possible to experiment with innovation, you'll all be better off. And so if there are a lot of reasons why that gets muddled, and that gets to be different interests fighting different things. But if you start with that principle, specifically on the issue of business creation and interface with institutions, there's a new paper coming out, it's not out yet, that looks across 20 years and I think 100 something countries, and finds that the introduction of digitization of bureaucracy, even without changes in institutional legal requirements, has sort of an accidental effect of decreasing the amount of time costs associated with compliance. So looking at adopting streamlined online app solutions, et cetera, for interfacing with government, I think that's a way to sort of leapfrog and have non-political reform change in the interest of entrepreneurs. But then beyond that, I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we are working currently at the foundation with one of the projects precisely to tackle this situation. Because on one hand, we have the rule of law that doesn't apply equally to all the people residing in Spain. I mean, whether you are a national, you have a different treatment than an immigrant resident in Spain in terms of entrepreneurship, how you were putting it earlier. So there's going to be a very ambitious study where we are going to have some recommendations for the policy reforms we want to recommend to the public institutions, to the political stakeholders at the national and local and regional level. And the idea is that Spain needs to update its immigration policy towards more an open frontier approach to attract talent and not only low training or zero training immigrants who also are welcome, of course, and they perform a very important task in our society because they are covering jobs that nationals don't like and don't want to have. So we have to be very careful in stepping on the speech of and this kind of bad speech by some extremist groups who are using immigrant citizens to sort of say a bad narrative about them, and this is a very, very dangerous speech that we have to take care of. But at the same time, we have to be very aware that all the regulation in Spain are meant for people to depend on one way or another of the state. And this is the big problem. This is the root of the problem in Spain, in opposition to other countries around us. So we must tackle that, because if we tackle that, we are going to also secondarily resolve the problem for immigrants who want to come here or are already here and want to start a business and have it easier, both of them, and also the national citizens of our country. I mean, we are a country who needs a lot of entrepreneurship and who needs to stop bleeding in the numbers of unemployment people, and especially in the numbers of unemployment youth of our country. So if there are any more questions, I believe we conclude the conference. Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you all. And have a lovely evening.